I'm sure you've heard about Jeffrey Epstein's little black book and the implications that it could carry, but very few people have heard about the story of John David Norman's little black book of index cards and all the names of the powerful people that were on them. Not much is known about John David Norman's early life. The little bit that is known, he seemed just to be a normal kid. His criminal record started in 1954 at the age of 27 and continued on all the way until his death in 2011. And even though he did have an extensive criminal record, he mysteriously was able to avoid almost any significant prison time. This is going to become a recurring theme throughout his life and our story we're going to cover today. And throughout his life, he rubbed elbows with the rich, the powerful, the famous, and he repeatedly avoided justice. And he also seemingly had an unlimited amount of backing, both financially and legally. John David Norman was more than just a notorious predator. He was the operator of an elite human and blackmail organization that commingled serial killers, federal employees, and the global elite, all while having the protection of the federal government and other powerful groups and people. He was the beta test for modern trafficking networks we see today, like Jeffrey Epstein's, Diddy's, and the many others we have yet to discover. So join me today as we look into the story of John David Norman, or the Index Card King. If you were to quickly research John David Norman, you'd probably just come to the conclusion that he was kind of an itinerant drifter that maybe had a small network or group of like-minded predators that distributed CSAM or child abuse material, but he was much more than that. John David Norman was a high-achieving student and a broadcast engineer. He was charming, self-sufficient, and blended perfectly into society. He was a technician that understood how to build systems. Keep that in mind for later, guys. So John David Norman was born in 1927 in Ada, Oklahoma. He was described by a newspaper at the time as, quote, a top-performing student, pianist, and a Cub Scout. He seemed to just be a normal child, but by the age of 27, he had already been accused of some horrific crimes. In the 1950s, he was arrested twice, both for assault and both in Houston. Unfortunately, court records don't give us too much information into these arrests, but it's really not that big of a deal because he actually wasn't convicted on either of them. And according to court records, he was first convicted of quote-unquote crimes in 1960 and served a very short sentence. And he was arrested again not too long after that for another short period. But to John David Norman, this wasn't a bad thing. It actually allowed him to further understand the legal system and eventually how to poke holes in it. The next time we hear about John David Norman, it's about 2 years later, and this time he's in Dallas. At some point after his most recent arrest that we just talked about, he moved from Houston to Dallas. And after this move is where things start to get even darker. Once he arrived in Dallas, Norman created his first of many businesses based on the selling, trading, and distribution of CSAM. The first business that he created was a newsletter titled Oliver's Desert Rat Scrapbook, which was supposedly, quote, a pocket-sized newspaper covering the Great Southwest, end quote. But of course, there's more to the story. This newsletter was really just a cover for John David Norman to distribute CSAM to other PDF files around the country, with one revealing quote from the newsletter reading, "Mountain climbers rope themselves together because there is safety in numbers. Also, it keeps the sensible ones from going home." Remember that for later. And remember, as I said before, Norman was an engineer that understood how to build systems. He built systems and networks as a broadcast engineer. And his first broadcast was his Desert Rat Scrapbook newsletter that we just talked about. But Norman didn't just want one victim. He wanted an entire network of victims and abusers. And he wanted to collect the profits from that abuse. But this network was not just for the pleasure and profit of Norman. No. He was actually building a network of people that all had dirt on each other. He was actually laying the groundwork for the epidemic of blackmail infrastructure we see today, like I said, with Epstein, Diddy, and all the other ones we don't know about. And his own newsletter actually perfectly described this function in the quote from earlier. Remember, mountain climbers rope themselves together because there is safety in numbers. Also, it keeps the sensible ones from going home. That means they're all roped together, right, through the dirt that they each have on each other, right? That protects them, and it also discourages anyone from leaving or telling law enforcement. Think about it. If one of us gets caught, we all get caught. If his newsletter was the rope that tied all of his associates together, his next move was building the fortress from which they could operate from. Norman took his technical understanding of systems and applied it to the real world. He did this through Epic International and the Odyssey Foundation. He turned a fringe community into a streamlined, corporate-style trafficking organization. But everything leading up to this so far was actually just preparation for Norman. It actually prepared him for building a physical infrastructure that looked perfectly legal from the outside and allowed him to take his sick practices in person and across the country. So the next thing we're going to get into is the Odyssey Foundation. The Odyssey Foundation started off as just a continuation of his previous newsletter, the Desert Rat Scrapbook. But unlike the Desert Rat Scrapbook, he did a little bit more than just distributing the CSAM. And this is where it gets a little dark, guys, so buckle in. This new business, this new newsletter, the continuation of the previous one, like I said, instead of acting as a distribution ring or a place to trade things, right? It actually served as a catalog for an underage boy ring that John David Norman was running himself. This was discovered actually in 1973. The FBI received an anonymous tip telling them of a supposed illegal underage boy ring. When the FBI responded to this warrant by raiding the house, guess who they found there? John David Norman. But John David Norman wasn't by himself. With him in his house were 5 underage boys, a mountain of CSAM, and multiple cameras for creating that CSAM. And as the police were looking through this material, they very quickly understood what was going on. They understood that Norman was operating a prostitution ring, an illegal underage prostitution ring. And while they were digging through his apartment, they made a really interesting discovery. They discovered a whole cache of index cards, approximately 30,000. On these index cards was the names, contact information of thousands, 30,000. They say even more, there's multiple names written on just one index card. They contain the names of all sorts of rich, powerful, and influential people. As the police kept digging into his organization, the Odyssey Foundation, they soon realized that Norman had actually registered it as a non-profit with the quote-unquote aims to enhance the lives of underprivileged children by connecting them with adult sponsors that take them on educational adventures, end quote. The sponsors would pay for food, boarding, travel. They would cover it all. They would arrange it through the catalog. Remember, he was still sending out this newsletter, but on this new newsletter, right, was a catalog of all these underage boys, which they called fellows. So you had the sponsors, which were PDF file associates of John David Norman, and then you had fellows, which were victims, underage boys that John David Norman somehow was able to gain control over. But these adventures that they took the kids on were far from educational. The Odyssey Foundation actually served as a for-profit national child ring. Norman advertised this ring through his catalog, for which he charged an initial enrollment fee and then a per catalog fee after that. Remember, catalogs containing the names, pictures, and biographies of fellows, underage boys. So for a price, these sponsored would be sent one of these catalogs. They would look through the catalogs and they would find a fellow or an underage victim that they liked, and then John David Norman would arrange with them. They would get the plane tickets, and this kid would fly out to the sponsor, and they would spend 2 or 3 days going on educational adventures. I think we all know what was really happening, and it's very, very disturbing. But if you can believe it, the story gets even darker, so buckle in. What Norman did here was a masterclass in hiding in plain sight. By registering the Odyssey Foundation as a nonprofit, he weaponized the system in his favor. He took words that we associate with kindness, like foundation and educational adventures, and turned them into a code for a national child ring. It's literally the ultimate corporate disguise. But was it really that good of a disguise? Think about it. If you were to go over and just be given this information and be told the story of this operation, that you have these fellows, underage, underprivileged kids, and you have these older, more powerful people, it doesn't take really hard math to figure out what's really going on. And John David Norman treated these kids like items in a mail order catalog. It's truly sick and it's truly disturbing. He made the abuse literally feel like a business transaction. But the real genius and the real horror was that he wasn't just selling a service. He was actually building a database of the sick and the powerful. Those 30,000 index cards with the names of politicians, federal employees, and powerful people weren't just his client list. They were his protection. He thought that as long as the people at the top were sponsoring his system, the system would never tear him down. But much like Jeffrey Epstein, he would find out that the system was much bigger than just him. So, after police raided Norman's apartment and discovered the 30,000 index cards, the underage boys, and basically discovered that he was running a underage national child ring. So, after police raided Norman's apartment and found the underage boys, the CSAM, the 30,000 index cards, it became clear that he was running more than just an underage illegal ring. He had, inadvertently or not, created the ultimate blackmail insurance policy, akin to Jeffrey Epstein's Little Black Book. And according to Lieutenant Harold Hancock of the Dallas PD, quote, the list included prominent people and federal government employees, end quote. Having evidence that someone is a PDF file pretty much gives you complete control over that person. Almost all major countries' intelligence agencies collect that type of information. It's the reason why Jeffrey Epstein was able to fly under the radar for so long. He was valuable to our intelligence agencies because he had control, or blackmail, over a ton of different powerful and prominent people. And if they arrest him, he can no longer collect that information for him. So that's why they kept him out of jail, kept him operating their scheme. And well, if he is arrested, it wasn't the intelligence agencies. Oh no, it's that sicko Jeffrey Epstein. He did it all on his own. We have no idea. It was all Jeffrey. He just was a sick individual. He never trafficked individuals to anyone except himself. That was it. Whatever. So, back to the raid where they found the index cards. Not only did they find all those cards with the names of the sponsors on them, they found a list of thousands of names of the fellows, other underage boy victims. But the disturbing part is that some of these names had the word kill stamped next to them. And once again, we're about to experience the institutional backing of Norman. So to any logical person, it's pretty obvious what that word kill being stamped next to their name implies. It means that that boy, for whatever reason, needs to go, to put it softly, right? To any logical person, that's obviously what that means. But not according to John David Norman. John David Norman had a different excuse. His excuse was simple. He said that the word kill just simply meant that those boys had been fired, that they were no longer part of the organization. And guess what? The police believed him. And instead of some huge mass arrest and the justice finally being served, nope, they handed over these 30,000 index cards to the State Department for passport fraud. Yeah, you heard me right. For passport fraud. That was what they claimed they wanted these index cards for. To once again quote Lieutenant Harold Hancock of Dallas PD, I felt that some federal agency should get the cards, and I contacted the State Department through the FBI. All the cards were sent to Washington to the State Department, and that's the last I heard of it, end quote. Wow. So the FBI investigated the names of the people on the index cards, but they very quickly realized that none of these people on these index cards were connected to any sort of passport fraud. So they destroyed the evidence. At least that was the explanation that they gave us. So not only did the police believe Norman's story about the kill words being stamped next to their name, and it just meant that they're being fired, they actually purposely destroyed the names of thousands and thousands of rich, powerful, and prominent people that were directly involved with a child ring. Please make that make sense to me. It is so unbelievably, just mind-blowingly frustrating. They just destroyed the evidence, right? It's right there. It's right there in front of them. Oh, but no. Oh, we're just looking into passport fraud. Why not look into the child ring that is right in front of you? What? But I don't think this is just out of incompetence. I don't think they are truly that dumb. They're doing this for a reason. For 20 years, the system gave Norman a pass, a get out of jail free card, through so many arrests, assault, deviancy. He was literally found in a raid with tons of child abuse material with children that weren't his, 5 underage children that were not his, with him in an apartment with CSAM and cameras. And what does he get? A slap on the wrist. A slap on the wrist. And when justice was finally served, it was towards the very end of his life, and he died just a few years into his sentence. And this situation is like so eerily familiar to Epstein's. They both avoided justice for pretty much their entire life until the very end of their life. They both died in custody, and they both single-handedly took the blame for the entire organization that they were working on behalf of. But where they differ is their intention. I believe Epstein was specifically instructed to do the things that he did and to build the networks and collect the blackmail that he did. While on the other hand, I don't think Norman initially set out to create a blackmail ring. I believe he set out to create a child ring for greed and for his own sick pleasures. Maybe an intelligence agency convinced Norman, either knowingly or unknowingly, to create this ring in order to collect blackmail, but I don't believe he knew he was collecting blackmail though, regardless. So when the Dallas police got these index cards, they sent them to the State Department, to the FBI. I'm sure one of these intelligence agencies caught wind of that, took a look at it, realized how valuable the information they saw in front of them was, and decided to keep it for themselves, which would explain why it was quote unquote destroyed. And after seeing all the different powerful, prominent people that Norman could collect blackmail on, they made sure that he only walked away with a slap on the wrist so he could continue to collect these names. Like I said, knowingly or unknowingly. He might not have even known that they were doing this, but it really doesn't make a difference. And I think they continued to protect him throughout his entire life until he got to a point where he was just, his appetite for deviancy was just too insatiable. He was too uncontrollable, too unpredictable. And at that point, they let him take the fall for the group, and he was just thrown right under the bus as the sole fall guy. So working with John David Norman, the intelligence apparatus was able to develop a blueprint in which they later applied to Jeffrey Epstein, Sean P. Diddy Combs, and probably many others. Epstein is just one operative entangled in a web of blackmail and deviancy. John David Norman wasn't just a predator who got lucky. He was the trial run. The system watched a broadcast engineer from Oklahoma manually build a database of 30,000 names, and they soon realized that human depravity could be harnessed as the ultimate tool of control. When the State Department destroyed those index cards in the 70s, they weren't just protecting the peoples whose names were on those index cards, the politicians, the prominent people, the powerful. They were protecting the future of the blackmail industry. From the kill stamps of the Odyssey Foundation to the flight logs of Lolita Express, the faces change, but the architecture remains the same. Norman died in a cell, and Epstein died in a cell. But the sponsors, they're still in the catalogs. They're still in power. And as long as the sensible ones are still roped together by their secrets, the climb continues. The question isn't who the next Epstein will be. The question is, how many more index cards are being collected right now? If you found this deep dive into the architecture of control valuable, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe. It's the only way to push this video through the algorithm so I can keep making them. I'm actually currently working on a follow-up video exploring the specific ties between Norman's kill list and the serial killers of the 1970s. It's going to be really interesting. You won't want to miss it, I promise you. So thanks for watching, and stay sovereign.